Imagine God appears to you with blueprints for the impossible. Build a boat bigger than anything humanity has ever constructed. Make it watertight, 3 floors, compartments for thousands of animals, and do it in a desert, far from any ocean. Noah looked at those measurements and faced a choice. This is the story of what he did next. The first challenge wasn't carpentry, it was geography. Where do you construct a vessel 450 feet long when there's no body of water nearby large enough to launch it? The answer reveals something most people miss. Noah wasn't building a boat designed to be launched. He was building a floating refuge designed to rise with the water. Therefore, location strategy shifted completely. He needed space. Massive, level space. Because 450 feet is longer than a modern football field including both end zones, and 75 feet wide means you can't squeeze this into any narrow clearing. Noah probably surveyed the region for weeks, looking for terrain that met brutal requirements: flat ground, firm soil that wouldn't shift under colossal weight, proximity to forests dense enough to supply thousands of trees, access to water for the family to survive during construction, and distance from populated areas where mockers would interfere daily. Once chosen, the real labor began. Leveling. You can't build something this size on uneven ground. Every slope creates stress points that will crack the hull later. Without bulldozers or excavators, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, spent months clearing brush, removing boulders, filling depressions, compacting soil, until they had a platform solid enough to support an estimated 15,000 gallons to 20,000 gallon tons. But here's the detail that changes everything. Rain. When it rains on an unprotected construction site, you get mud. Tools sink, wood rots, work stops. Therefore, Noah likely dug drainage channels around the entire perimeter, small trenches angled to direct water away from the building area. Strategic ditching so the work zone stayed dry even during storms. And while Noah sweated, digging, leveling, preparing, neighbors passed by. Some laughed, others shook their heads. A man preparing a giant plot to build a boat far from any river or sea. Madness. Had to be madness. But this is what they didn't understand. Noah wasn't building for the world that existed. He was building for the world that was about to disappear underwater. Weeks, maybe months later, the ground was ready. Level, firm, drained. But now came the challenge that would make everything else seem trivial. Getting enough wood to build something the size of a 4-story building. How many trees do you need to fell to construct something the size of a modern cargo ship? Mature trees take decades, sometimes centuries to grow. These are tall trees with thick, heavy trunks. A single tree like that can weigh several tons. And to build a structure 450 feet long, hundreds of trees, possibly thousands. But felling a massive tree with bronze axes isn't like chopping firewood. Bronze dulls quickly. You strike, strike, strike at the same point. Wood chips fly, your arms ache, your hands bleed. And after hours, the cut still hasn't passed halfway through the trunk. Therefore, 2 men worked together, one on each side. They alternated strikes to maintain rhythm, and when the trunk finally began to give way, came the most dangerous moment. Which direction will it fall? A 60-foot tree falling in the wrong direction can kill anyone nearby. It can crash into other trees and get hung up. It can split when hitting the ground and become useless. Therefore, Noah and his sons probably cut strategic wedges guiding the fall. They tied ropes high in the crown to pull in the correct direction. And when the tree finally fell, with a boom that echoed through the forest, the work had barely begun. Because now you need to move that giant trunk to the work site. And how do you move something the size of a bus without wheels, without tractors, without cranes? A mature cypress log weighs easily several tons lying on the forest floor. Immobile, defying any attempt to budge it. The most likely solution was the same used by Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and other ancient civilizations: wooden rollers. You cut smaller, thinner trunks, position several under the large log, then tie ropes to the front and begin pulling. As the log advances, rolling over the cylinders, you take the rollers left behind and reposition them in front. It's slow, brutally exhausting, but it works. But here's the detail that complicates everything. Uneven terrain. Rolling logs on flat surfaces is already difficult. On slopes, valleys, stones, dangerous. An uncontrolled log going down a hillside becomes a deadly weapon. It can roll over whoever is guiding it. It can hit rocks and split. It can fall into ravines and be lost completely. Therefore, before moving any log, Noah probably needed to prepare paths, level the ground, remove large stones, create wide trails. Weeks of extra work just to transport wood safely. And there's another problem, manpower. Even with rollers, you need many men pulling ropes simultaneously. Noah had 3 sons, 4 men total. Could they alone? Difficult. It's possible they hired local workers, people who needed work and didn't care about the strange reasons behind the construction. Each log that arrived at the site represented days of effort. Aching muscles, ropes that broke at the worst moment, sometimes fatal accidents. And while some boards dried stacked with spacing for air circulation, Noah continued felling more trees. An endless cycle of work. But soon would come the part that would truly test his skill as a builder, raising the structure without it collapsing before being finished. How do you raise a 3-deck structure without it toppling before being complete? The answer begins with something most people never think about: the keel, the master central beam that functions as the backbone of any vessel. Without it, you just have a pile of boards that don't support themselves. But here's the engineering challenge. The Ark's keel needed to be 450 feet long. No tree in the world is that size. Therefore, Noah had to join multiple enormous beams, one splicing into another, creating a continuous line. Each splice needed to be perfect. Male-female joints locked with hardwood pegs, because if the keel cracked or split, the entire Ark would break with it. And after the keel came the ribs. Curved beams rising from the sides giving shape to the hull, but how do you curve wood without breaking it? Steam and heat. You slowly heat the wood, leaving it flexible, then gradually bend it, fixing in the desired shape until it cools and hardens. Slow, delicate process. A cracked rib means weeks of work lost. Now think about scale. Dozens of giant ribs needed to be fitted into the keel, spaced uniformly, all at the exact angle. A mistake of a few degrees and the structure becomes crooked, unbalanced, unstable. Therefore, Noah probably used stretched ropes as guides, careful markings, stone plumb bobs to check verticality, and even so, adjusting a beam weighing several tons into perfect fit required coordinated brute force, rudimentary pulleys, levers, men pulling ropes in sync. And there's another critical detail: diagonal reinforcements, beams crossed forming triangles. Why? Because triangles are the most stable geometric shape that exists, impossible to deform without breaking. Therefore, the internal structure was a complex network of interlaced wood, distributing weight and resisting pressure. When the Ark's skeleton was finally standing, Noah looked at that giant structure and realized, now came the part that would decide whether everything would float or sink, sealing every crack, every joint, every microscopic fissure. Because a single failure would be enough to kill everyone inside. Pitch, plant resin boiled until becoming a sticky, toxic, burning paste. The Bible is specific. You shall cover it inside and outside with pitch. Genesis 6:14. This double command saved everything. Because pitch on the outside isn't enough. Water finds a way. It seeps from underneath, rots wood from inside. Therefore, every inch needed to be sealed from both sides. But here's the part few imagine: applying pitch inside the Ark. Enclosed spaces, dark, without adequate ventilation. The toxic fumes concentrated, making the air almost unbreathable. Working in there meant frequently going outside to breathe fresh air. Returning, applying more, going out again. Hours of interrupted work. Burns on hands, irritated skin, and it wasn't a single coat, multiple layers. Wait for it to dry, apply another, check for cracks, reapply where necessary. Process that took weeks, maybe months. But the real test of the pitch would come when the Ark was in water. Until then, it was impossible to know if any joint had failed, if any microscopic crack would allow seepage. Therefore, each application was an act of faith as much as technique. When the last coat of pitch dried, the Ark was sealed. But now came the challenge of dividing the giant interior into organized compartments, because thousands of animals would need to live in there for over a year. And without organization, total chaos. How do you organize a giant structure's interior to house thousands of animals for over a year? The Bible gives a clue: 3 decks. And it mentions rooms or nests. In Hebrew, kinim, literally meaning nests or cells. Small, separated spaces. But why? Because without divisions, you'd have chaos. Animals fighting, predators attacking prey. Diseases spreading rapidly. Therefore, each species needed its own space. Walls between them. Safety. But here's the engineering challenge: building internal walls without compromising structure. Each wall adds weight, changes load distribution, therefore, the most likely logic is: place heavy animals on the lower deck. Elephants, rhinoceros, hippopotamus. Low center of gravity prevents the ark from capsizing. Medium animals on the second deck: lions, bears, horses. And the smallest, birds and light creatures, on the top deck. Strategic weight distribution to maintain balance, but there's another problem nobody thinks about: waste. Thousands of animals producing waste every day. Without a drainage system, the ark would become a toxic sewer in weeks. Diseases would kill everyone before the flood ended. Therefore, there were probably sloped channels in the floors, small grooves directing liquids toward specific points. Maybe openings in the lower sides, allowing waste to drain outward once the ark was floating. Simple, but effective. And ventilation. The Bible mentions a window or opening at the top. The Hebrew word tsohar in Genesis 6:16 could mean a window or possibly a light ventilation shaft. But that's not enough to ventilate 3 entire decks. There were probably strategic side openings protected by overhangs to prevent water entry, but allowing air circulation. Without adequate ventilation, heat and gases would accumulate. Animals suffocating, everyone dying before the water receded. And there's still food storage. A year's worth of feed for thousands of animals means tons of hay, grains, dried fruits. Spaces dedicated only to warehouses. Organized for easy access, but protected from moisture. When all this internal structure was finally ready, Noah had built something more complex than a simple boat. But there was still the most critical part: the door. A huge opening that needed to be strong enough not to compromise the entire structure. The ark's door couldn't be small. Giraffes needed to enter. Elephants, animals of all sizes. Therefore, it was an enormous opening. And here's the engineering problem. The larger the opening, the weaker the wall becomes. It's a structural vulnerability point. A giant door in a wall that needs to withstand water pressure from all sides. Dangerous. Therefore, location mattered. The Bible mentions the door was on the side, not at the front or back. This makes sense. Side walls distribute pressure better than ends, and a side door allows better balance during animal entry. But the door needed heavy reinforcements around it. Extra beams forming a robust frame, thicker wood, stronger joints, everything to compensate for the structural weakness of the opening. And there's another interesting detail. The Bible doesn't mention Noah installing bolts or locks. Why? Because it says it was God who closed the door. Genesis 7:16. This means Noah built trusting that his part was making the structure, but the divine sealing would come later. Still, the sealing around the door needed to be perfect. Therefore, probably extra layers of pitch, maybe flexible material at the edges, something like plant fibers soaked in resin, functioning as a primitive seal. When the door closed, these fibers would press against the wall, sealing completely. And think about the size of hinges needed, or better, the pivot system, because metal hinges would be rare and expensive. Probably a vertical shaft of reinforced wood, allowing the door to swing. Heavy but functional. When the door was finally installed, tested, sealed, construction was complete. Decades of work, thousands of hours, mountains of wood transformed into a structure that defied logic. But now came the strangest part of all. Something no builder could plan or control, because suddenly, without anyone guiding them, animals began appearing on their own. How do you test a giant vessel without putting it in water? You don't. You can't. The ark was built on dry land, far from any body of water large enough. Therefore, all the work of decades depended on mental calculations, practical experience, and faith that the proportions given by God would work. But Noah could do some final checks. Walk through the entire structure, checking every joint, looking for cracks that appeared during the pitch drying, testing the firmness of beams, pushing walls to feel if they were solid or if something gave. And he probably progressively loaded provisions, sacks of grain, bundles of hay, jars of water, observing how the structure reacted to additional weight, listening, because wood under pressure makes sounds. It creaks, groans, booms, and if something was wrong, Noah would hear it. But the real surprise came when animals began appearing. The Bible says they came to Noah 2 by 2, Genesis 7:9. They weren't hunted. They weren't dragged. They came alone. Imagine the scene, animals spontaneously migrating from all directions, predators walking peacefully beside prey, birds flying and landing near the entrance, reptiles crawling, all converging toward the same place as if an invisible force guided them. And here's the detail that closes everything. Each animal went directly to its compartment. No confusion, no fights, as if they knew exactly where they should stay. This was no longer a human project. It was something beyond Noah's capacity to control or explain. When the last animal entered, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives entered too. 8 people total. And then what was written happened. God closed the door. Construction was complete. But now the real test began. The wood rotted away millennia ago. The animals left no trace. Archaeologists still search for remnants on mountain slopes. But the legacy isn't in the boards. It's in the blueprint. Hebrews 11 says, Noah condemned the world by building, not with words, with wood. Every tree he felled was a prophecy. Every plank he shaped declared, a judgment is coming, and mercy has prepared a way. He built for 120 years. The flood lasted 40 days. But what he constructed in faith has echoed for 4 Suzerain years. You don't need to see the flood to start building. You don't need to convince everyone around you. You just need to hear God's voice saying, build and pick up your tools. Because faith isn't believing the ark will float. Faith is cutting the first tree when everyone thinks you're insane.